Hello, everyone. Today we are going to be doing a brief overview tour of the respiratory system. So, for those of you listening along, lean back. We are going to talk about first the upper respiratory system and then the lower respiratory system. For those of you that need a visual reference, I highly recommend going to KenHub or using Cleveland Clinic, which is the image that I have pulled up here is from Cleveland Clinic. They're usually pretty crisp and easy to understand what we are talking about in the diagram. So let's get started. We're going to talk about the upper respiratory tract first. This is the first area that air enters into the body. So when we are inhaling, inspiring air, we are inhaling through two main airways. That's going to be either the nose, the nasal cavity here, through the nares, which is what we call the nostrils, or the oral cavity or the mouth. Now, important to note that the nasal cavity is the primary entrance for air. The nasal cavity is lined with cilia. Those are itty bitty tiny hair-like projections, not to be confused with monstrously large nose hairs. And mucus that warms, moistens, and filters the air, trapping all that dust, pollen, particulates, pathogens. It also contains olfactory receptors for your sense of smell. And then the very back by the nasopharynx, some taste buds for your sense of taste, but that's a different lecture for a different day. So your nose highly conditions and moistens the air. Your mouth, however, does not. It serves as a secondary airway, especially when you need more air, like during heavy exercise, but it is not anywhere near as effective as filtering and warming the air as the nose. The nose should be your primary place of intake of air. Now, next we have the pharynx, otherwise known as your throat, and that's going to get all of the air that's brought in by the nasal cavity and from the mouth. It also collects food and liquids from the mouth. It helps direct air into the trachea and food into the esophagus. We'll talk about the digestive system later. Right now, we're focusing on air intake, but do know that your mouth and the pharynx do both things. After the pharynx, we have the larynx, which is the voice box. All right. Its primary function in the body is to produce sound. It does act as a gateway from the pharynx, the throat, to the trachea. But more importantly, it allows air to pass over the vocal cords, which vibrate to produce sound when that air passes over them. This area also provides protection because the epiglottis is there. The epiglottis is this thick flap of tissue that closes over the larynx when you swallow, preventing food and liquid from entering the airway. So these things are all what is considered your upper respiratory tract. That is your nasal cavity, your oral cavity, your pharynx, and your larynx. Now we're going to move down into the lower respiratory tract, going after the larynx into the trachea. Now, the trachea looks like it would be a muscular tube, just like the pharynx, the larynx, the esophagus, all these other things in your body, but there's something super important and very different about it. The trachea, otherwise known as your windpipe, is super sturdy. It's lined with these C-shaped rings of cartilage that help to keep it open at all times. If it collapsed flat, like the esophagus or your intestines, it would not be able to carry down air, which doesn't have a lot of pressure and volume sometimes going down. It needs to remain open for that free flow of air. Fun fact, it is also lined with cilia, those little hair-like projections, and mucus to continue filtering the air as it goes down into the lungs. Now, the trachea then branches off into two different bronchus, which is plural as bronchi. We have the left and the right bronchus, the two main bronchi. Each one of these lead into a separate lung, all right? Then these primary bronchi branch off into secondary and tertiary bronchi. They keep breaking off into smaller and smaller branches as they go down, eventually leading into tiny little branches like twigs on a tree called bronchioles. In fact, the entire branching system is often called the bronchial tree. Its job is to keep airways open and to distribute that air all throughout the lungs. Now, it is pretty important to point out here that your two lungs are slightly different. Your right lung has 3 lobes, whereas the left lung only has 2. And there is also a cardiac notch in the left lung to allow space for the heart. So your right lung definitely has quite a bit more volume expanse in there and ability to hold air in there. Now, bronchioles, back to the bronchioles. These are the smallest branches of the bronchial tree. They don't have any cartilage anymore, but they are surrounded by smooth muscle, which allows them to constrict or dilate to control airflow as you're trying to breathe. These can unfortunately constrict during things such as asthma, making it very, very difficult to breathe. As we get further down, you'll see that the bronchioles branch into little grape-like clusters, these little air sacs called alveoli. Now, alveoli are the final and most important part of the respiratory system. All right. This is where the vital gas exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide actually occurs in the body. So there's tons of tiny blood vessels, the capillaries that surround them. So oxygen from the air that is inhaled into the lungs diffuses through the thin walls of the alveoli and capillaries into the blood. And at the same time, the air waste product, the carbon dioxide, diffuses from the blood into the alveoli to be exhaled. All right. There's also a liquid in there called a surfactant, which reduces surface tension and prevents the alveoli from collapsing, which is pretty cool. We don't talk about that very much, though, on the licensing exam. I just wanted to throw it out there for you. But please note, the lungs are not muscular. They are surrounded by a pleural membrane and the diaphragm, which create the pressure changes needed for breathing. So the lungs don't pump up and then deflate themselves. So they're just there as giant bags or a sack to hold the gas. All right. Much like the bladder, which we'll talk about later, is a sack that is going to hold urine. The lungs don't inflate and deflate on their own. We rely on the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is the primary muscle of respiration. Okay. It lies right underneath the lungs. Super important muscle of the body. Good thing to note on the licensing exam, it is innervated by the phrenic nerve. When it contracts, it flattens and pulls downward. All right, so it's going to flatten and go downward, which increases all of this volume in the chest cavity, and it pulls air into the lungs, which is called inhalation. When this muscle relaxes, it's going to go upwards into the chest cavity. It's no longer tightening and pulling down. And when it moves back up, it's going to decrease the chest space and push air out of the lungs, causing exhalation. All right. So, summary of the breathing process, we have inhalation, which is the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. Remember, inner means between, costal means rib. Muscles contracting, they expand the chest cavity. The lungs don't do this themselves. This creates negative pressure, pulling air in through the nose and mouth to fill up that vacuum that's been created. Air travels down the nasal cavity into the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, through the bronchi and the bronchioles, and finally reaches the alveoli. Then gas exchange occurs. In the alveoli, oxygen enters the blood and carbon dioxide leaves the blood, and then exhalation occurs. Now that we have a high volume of carbon dioxide, the diaphragm and intercostal muscles relax, the chest cavity gets smaller, and now air that is full of CO2 is pushed back out of the body. Now, one thing I'd like to point out here for my visual learners, when we talk about the bronchial tree, you can just imagine an upside down tree. The main trunk of the tree is like our trachea, that's very large and sturdy with these cartilaginous rings holding it open and upright. Then we have the primary bronchi branching off. These are our thickest branches. And then we have smaller and smaller branches. These are our secondary and tertiary bronchi. Then we have almost twig-like branches coming off of these. These are going to be our bronchioles. And then we have clusters of leaves or berries on the tree. These are going to be our alveoli. These are our air sac clusters where all the gas exchange takes place with the capillaries. All right, if you guys have any questions, you know how to reach me. I hope that this was informative. Please know that all of this information absolutely is on the MBLEx, that the lungs are the main organs of the respiratory system, that the nasal cavity is the primary air entrance for air, that the pharynx does both food and air intake, and the larynx main function in the body is for sound production. All right, everyone, have a great day. I'll see you on the next one.